Hi, I'm Lisa Rangel with Chameleon Resumes, and you are here for the Decoding PE interviews, what investors want to see, what they're going to ask, and we are going to jump in here with my guest, Andrew Goodman of NewCo Talent Partners. I'm going to have him introduce himself in just a minute. We have a great audience so far here today. A lot of familiar faces, some new faces. Andy, thank you so much for joining us. Just to give you a bit of history, Andy and I worked together a long time ago. And, this is a testament to networking and relationship building. We've kept in touch over the years. He was a guest on my show when it first launched a couple years ago, and it was such a popular topic. He has agreed to come back. Andy, tell us a little bit about you, why I want you here, why everyone's benefiting from listening to you here today, and
Hmm.
then we'll get to it.
Well, thank you for that. Hello, everybody. Yeah, as Lisa said, she and I worked together too long to mention ago, but I've been in the talent management and recruiting space for the bulk of my career. Started out in the recruiting space and took a shift over to leadership consulting, where I ran talent management for a company called Linkage Worldwide for a number of years. The interesting thing with Linkage is it was a private equity owned business, so I had firsthand experience as an operating leader within a private equity environment, which was my first foray at that time into the wonderful, wacky world of private equity. So there was a lot that I still draw from that experience. I then went on to working for a small company, a small consulting firm that was bought by a $5 billion conglomerate called Dacre, which is a German-based safety services company. But I ran their Asia Pacific unit, living in Melbourne, Australia, for about 4.5 years. So I had operating leadership experience from that perspective. Came back to the U.S. as the chief revenue officer for Dacre in North America before jumping into back into the executive search world, now with NewCo Talent and my partners Kit Cooper and Sky Sanders. So yeah, I've got an interesting perspective, I think, from a lot of experience working within the executive search environment, as well as leading teams and organizations that are owned by private equity, as well as large structured. Although Dacre is not publicly traded, it ran like a publicly traded company. So I'm excited to be here. This is a topic that is obviously quite germane in today's environment. Huge demand within the private equity sector continues to grow. What they look for continues to morph and crystallize over time. So it'll be really interesting to get into this dialogue.
I'm excited. I'm excited. Just a technical point for everyone in the chat. If you are sharing your LinkedIn profile, which is great, make sure you put the HTTPS in front so it is a clickable link for everyone. And, don't just post. Make sure you reach out to people, you connect, set up conversations. Don't wait for everybody to come to you. That's not how this works, right? So with that said, what I'm really excited about, Andy, when we were preparing for this is, everyone wants to know what to do on these private equity portco type of interviews. They want to know what are the characteristics that the PE investors are looking for. But I think there really needs to be a more prudent place to start in their own self-awareness if this is the right place for them. I think doing a self-awareness assessment of is PE really the right place for you, is really the first place to start in the preparation for this interview. Um, and I thought that when you brought that up during our prep, it was prudent. What would you say are some of the likely characteristics of an executive interviewing for these portco companies that tends to make them not do well on the interviews despite years of success in the environments they've
Yeah,
been in?
yeah, good
And
place
this
to
is everybody's got to
start.
listen to this. This is key because I'm
Yes.
telling you, nobody talks about this.
Well, it's an interesting place to start. So it kind of confirms, you start with the conclusions and the data behind the conclusions. And look, I want to say one thing up front. There's no absolutes, right? There are going to be situations that I may talk about, and Lisa and I may talk about, that you could say, well, geez, that's not what I experienced, and so there are going to be situations where there's going to be a difference. But I'm bringing more just the common themes and what we see more consistently. So to get to your question about, what doesn't work, what characteristics of execs or leaders tend to be disconfirming. If you are an executive or not even an executive, just if you're in an environment that where you tend to thrive in a highly structured environment, that you're not as comfortable with rapid change. I mean, every environment has its changes but if you're someone who, is more methodical and more structured in the way that you unfold your persona or unfold your work, private equity portfolio companies is likely not the place for you because most of the time these are highly changeable. Um, they're environments that are seeking more structure, seeking more efficiency, but in a very entrepreneurial way. So if you're coming from a place of with maybe it's a large publicly traded company where you're in a particular sector lane within that publicly traded company and you rely on a lot of different other people to sort of make up the whole and things kind of move slowly through the chain to get executed. That's not typically how things operate in a private equity environment. It's much faster. You certainly need to be collaborative, but it's the decision time between dialogue and execution is a nanosecond. So they would rather see people who are, a little less structured and perhaps more decisive in the way that they go about it, even if mistakes are made. It's an environment where if you make a mistake, you just have to recognize the mistake, pivot off it fast, and make the next decision. If you're in a highly structured environment, that's not necessarily afforded to you very easily. So that'd be one thing I would say to just be honest with yourself around the types of environments that you fit. And it's the old, square peg in a round hole. If
Mm.
you're trying to force yourself into an environment that is uncomfortable for you, recognize that. There's nothing wrong with it. Just aspire to be in the environment that where you thrive.
You
Um,
brought up a good point during our prep that is sort of a springboard onto what you just mentioned. Executives, I think, get to where they are in any background, any industry, because they typically are very, focused, controlled. They know exactly what they're doing. They know what they want to execute, and that can sometimes that appearance of control or that not even so appearance, not, the actual practice of control can
yeah.
be actually the problem. If
Well,
you often, if somebody's really like a sole actor, or if they are very much like, here's the playbook I use in every situation I go into, like if they're very structured and controlling, and I don't mean controlling in a bad way, but
yeah,
just
yeah. No, I
that
think you're onto it. I
that
think,
can
look, I
almost
think
be backfire.
no, that's right. The way you said it, I agree. I think if you are used to controlling the entire process and you're more of, it from point A to point Z, you're walking through those 26 steps.
Hmm.
And that's not typically what happens in the private equity environment. Now, the word control is an interesting one because as an executive in PE, you do need to be controlled with a lot of fury underneath the control. So it's sort of those folks that can combine, that high professional acumen, but with a get it done fast and effective spirit.
Hmm.
They tend to thrive.
Right.
So that's what the word control threw me. But if you're someone who, is better, in an environment where you can control and you must control all of the things that come at you,
Hmm.
you're not going to survive.
Right. Right.
Because, the idea of private equity or the idea of these portfolio companies, once they're invested in by a private equity firm, they're typically immediately going to be exercising a lot of change.
Hmm.
And that change might be personnel, it might be operating procedures, it might be, how the company is financially managed. I mean, there's a whole host of things that are going to start to change. So you have to be adaptable and you have to be, kind of just willing to kind of take that all in, understand it. This is where that control word comes in, that you're not kind of freaking out about it and
Right.
just move then into action. I think that's more what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and I think what are your thoughts around, part of the marketing, angle I used in getting people to find out about our event today was how some of the private equity firms are opening up to how they are looking at candidates that don't have PE backgrounds. Now, this is not
Yeah,
a floodgate. This is not,
yeah,
by any
yeah,
means a common thing by any means, but it's clearly just a little bit of a crack, right? Because it always used to be if you didn't have PE background, you're out, right? Even though it's like chicken or the egg, at some point, how do you get the PE experience? But anyway, in looking at people coming from different backgrounds, it's not a relaxation of the standards, but what transferable skills are they looking for from these individuals that they're now being open from looking at different backgrounds from?
yeah, yeah. There's a lot in that question. So, the idea of, there's always a bias, and there seems to be a stigma that, private equity firms will only hire people with private equity experience, and
Mm,
largely that has been true. In a lot, particularly in certain functions have a higher degree of that fact. If you're a CFO, for instance, and you're coming out of just a publicly traded company, it's pretty. You may not have the necessary skill set or experience, not necessarily skill set, experiences that a private equity firm might be looking for. However, it's more about your leadership style. It's more
mm,
about what experiences you're bringing to the table that are going to be transferable in a private equity owned business. And let's define private equity owned business.
right.
Where I typically tend, and where I'm coming from, and where I typically tend to work is in the small to lower to middle market. So these are companies, think about 50 to perhaps $300 million in revenue as a sort of
Mm,
a guardrail. I mean, um, middle market can go up to maybe 500 million in revenue, and we've done work with companies as low as 15 to 20 million in revenue. But the sweet spot is, those companies that are transitioning from small businesses to mid-sized businesses.
mm,
So in order to change that over, they want people with experience in that growth pattern typically. Now, oftentimes, if they look to people who've done it in private equity before because they've seen the playbook, they know the pulse, they know the environment, et cetera, et cetera. But what we've seen, and in talking to a lot of private equity investors and talent leaders out of private equity firms, there's a lot of that skill that exists in companies and people that perhaps just haven't been in private equity environments. So they don't want to miss great talent just because they haven't worked for ABCPE owned company.
right.
So it's more about the traits. It's more about what have they done, what traits do they bring to the table, what experiences, what proof do they have of accomplishing that. So we can pivot here if you want into sort of traits that are
Yeah.
we see as common.
Mm,
The first thing that comes to my mind that I always look for is leaders that can combine, that highly strategic visionary ability with, I'm going to say it, but military-like execution. It's where
mm,
they're very strategic. They have a strategic mindset. They can lead strategically, but they are executors. And that is something that you don't necessarily only need to have that from a private equity environment, but that's a critical trait.
right.
That ability to set the vision, set the strategy, but also just relentlessly execute, and not only yourself relentlessly execute, but get execution out of the people around you and the teams that you lead.
And
Um,
what would be like questions or, you know, conversation points that a PE investor would ask somebody being considered for one of these portco companies? If
one of the better
not to put you on the
questions I've
spot, but
No, no, it's a good one, and I had this just happen not too long ago, but a really great question that was asked was, how many decisions are currently on your desk that are stalled out? In other words, you've got a bunch of things coming at you, sitting on your desk. How many decisions are sitting there that are just stalled? They're not moving. They're not going anywhere.
hmm,
And if you're mired in not able to make a decision because you're waiting on someone else or you're waiting for this to happen, that's that typically can be deduced by how much is sitting on your desk that, you have this
Right.
pile high, list of to-dos that just aren't getting accomplished every day. It's a
But if
really
you
good
don't know the
question.
number,
Yeah, and it just forces you to think. And I would tell people on the call, like, think about that in your own world. I mean, if you're constantly frustrated by the inability to make decisions, not just yourself, but your organization, um, think about why and think about how you can move the needle, because that's something private equity firms do not typically stand for, are
Mhm.
decisions not being made. At the end of the day, they would rather see a decision made that perhaps, isn't the right one, but it was made with a lot of data behind it, which is something we should talk about also. So put a
Yeah.
note to that.
Yep.
But okay, maybe it didn't work, or maybe you're seeing that it's not going in the right direction, and that you pivot fast. So
Hmm.
again, it's this just fast decision making ability to get you and your team on the right path. So that's a question that I heard that I thought was great, because everybody can relate to it. We've all been there where we've got, multiple things sitting on our desk that aren't moving. You're frustrated as hell. You don't know what to do about it, but you need to be the one moving that ball.
Right.
So that would
And
be
and
one.
know how many. I think even knowing how many, some like I mean that it shows
Yeah.
what you're cognizant of what's happening on your desk, right?
Well, yeah, absolutely. And look, the other question, yeah, associated with that is, when you think about your last, 3 to 6 months of work, what's your track record of exceeding, uh, or at least meeting deadlines?
Hmm.
And how many deadlines did you miss?
Hmm.
Everybody misses deadlines. It happens. I mean, there are a lot of factors that are completely out of your control. So you're gonna miss a deadline because somebody didn't do something. So that's all fine, but you need to understand those patterns.
Hmm.
And if you're not meeting deadlines, why is it? So those are just some when you think about execution, these are some questions that I've heard, that I've talked to private equity investors. They tend to get into that decision making process, and they
Right.
tend to do it early in an interview typically. Um,
You gave me a list of 9 things and you just covered the first, but I almost want to go a smidge out of order because you mentioned, number 9 on my list that you gave me was highly self-aware, emotionally intelligent, low ego,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And high team. And I think we mentioned a few things that I think sometimes accomplished executives can have a problem with. Um, owning when they've made a mistake, right? That was something you mentioned
mhm,
early on. They have to be
yeah,
able to own it, face it, say it, move on. Own, how many things are stalled on the desk. It might be 0, but it's probably highly unlikely. So it's being able to confidently, shoulders back, say like what the number is and be self-aware as to what your part in it is. Because I
yeah,
think when you are in these pressure cooking type of environments that private equity can be, very deadline driven, if you're too emotionally wrapped up in the decision mistake or the oversight, like that
yeah.
in and of itself is the problem versus the actual mistake, right? And you have to be able to own it quickly, fix it, move on.
Yeah, you're 100% right, and I would combine this a little bit. I mentioned data-driven decision making.
Yeah, that's number 2. There's
Um,
number 2. For those
yeah,
of you
look,
tracking, we're a little out of
well,
order.
it is all about proof. The private equity environment. And honestly, I kind of feel like this. We keep saying private equity environment. I think this is true in any environment, frankly. If you're
Absolutely. Should
the
be
the
at least,
better
right?
data-driven you are towards making decisions, the better
Hmm.
decisions you're going to make, number one, and the better you're going to lead people because there's data behind your decisions. It's not just a whimsical or an emotional decision. It's baked in what you've been able to amass as fact.
Right.
And that goes to, to be highly self-aware is to be able to also, see what's coming at you, be confident that what you're seeing is something you can act on,
Hmm.
and being emotionally intelligent, meaning understanding what you know and what you don't know,
Hmm.
understanding how it's going to relate to the people around you, and act accordingly.
Right.
Not an easy one to explain, but it's sort of, one of those. I constantly see really thriving executives in private equity environments that are, at the end of the day, just, high ego, low ego is sort of a way to say it. In other words, you have to be confident. You certainly need an ego,
Yeah.
and you need to, be very confident in what you're doing, but you have a low ego approach.
Mm-hmm.
It's more about the team. It's more about how you collaborate. It's more about how you get things done through others.
Mm-hmm.
Again, very consistent kind of characteristic for any leadership success, but it seems to be highlighted more in a private equity environment for sure.
Yeah, just I think
Um,
because of the nature of the deadlines, it's very,
Nature of the deadlines, you just don't have time to
yeah.
keep kind of rehashing and redoing things. It really is a matter of how do we get from point A to point B as effectively as
Mm-hmm.
possible.
And you've talked about like for number three, like growth and transformation experience. I mean, you have to have the actual experiences, ideally in private equity, but as somebody is, if they're starting to look
Yeah.
outside in the environments you've been in that maybe not have not been private equity backed, where have you
So
done that growth and transformation experience and how it transfers? Like what are
yeah,
your
this is where
thoughts
I
on
channel my inner Lisa Rangel. So when I look at resumes, right, and you look at resumes, we look at resumes all day, and particularly those that are coming from non-PE environments. So you've got an executive coming out of your private company, maybe a publicly traded company, what have you.
Hmm.
And when you see just kind of explanations of the job versus growth accomplishments,
Hmm.
I will always look for that. As do private equity investors. You want to understand where has this individual affected growth. Now, if you're in a go-to-market role, whether it be a sales leadership role or a marketing leadership role, perhaps it's a little bit easier to identify that. You move revenue
Hmm.
from A to B, or but you also, no matter what role you're in, if you're a head of HR, if you're a head of IT, if you're, head of engineering, whatever the function is, where
Hmm.
have you accomplished something that has enabled the company's growth? Could be
Right.
recruiting. It could be an IT infrastructure role. It could be engineering a new product or a change to a product. There's a variety of things that obviously we all do that affect growth, and maybe not as directly as a salesperson, but
Hmm.
certainly those things are being looked for by private equity recruiters and private equity
Right.
investors because they want to see that someone understands uh, the growth curve of their role. And it also goes to another critical trait, which is financial acumen.
Number four.
Um, you know, yeah, I mean, if you're, if this is for the non-CFOs, for CFO, it's kind of obvious you need to be very strong financially. But if no matter what function you're in, you need to understand how your decisions and your job affect the P&L. You don't need to you maybe understand fully how to manage a P&L from top to bottom, but you certainly need to know how to manage a budget. You
Hmm.
certainly need to know, what the expenses of your organization are and how that affects the P&L. And then decisions that you're making and your team are making that are affecting the P&L. It just needs to be you need to be acutely aware of it. So because it's something that you can't hide from in these environments when you're in a small company that just got invested a lot of capital. They're moving change through the process. They're looking for growth. They're looking for the company to move from point A to point B. Everything is about top line growth and bottom line efficiency.
That's it.
Um, so that's a critical important thing. So if you're out there and you're an HR exec or you're an exec any executive outside of finance, and this is an area you think you need to shore up on, get into tasks that are going to allow you to learn more about that.
Hmm.
Get into, try to really, buddy up with the CFO and learn how to read a P&L, in simple terms. But it becomes more important in these environments.
No, if you think about it in this way, if you have a bunch of chief marketing officers all being considered, you know, those that, all the marketing functions that everyone is doing, even maybe possibly the marketing achievements might be similar on every resume. The differentiator could be the one who is most financially astute,
No
so,
question about it.
then,
And there are countless examples of that. I mean, you bring up marketing, it's a good example function, if
Mhm.
you will, because, if you can be a very effective marketing leader from a, demand gen and, from the functionality of moving
Right.
things through the pipeline and, and moving, marketing statistics.
Hmm.
But if you don't understand how that affects the P&L, and how the things the marketing department are doing that affect the P&L, because marketing is a cost. but it's a cost that should have a very large ROI.
Absolutely.
So as a marketing leader, the more you can understand the return that your efforts are doing to the company, and how you're generating increased revenue and how you're generating
Right.
increased market share, that's what is going to be more important than implementing a Marcom system or something.
Right.
You need to really understand more of the growth aspects and the growth statistics and metrics that drive your role.
I mean, so many of these, we've covered four and number nine so far, but like they're all interwoven, because you need to know the data behind what you do and how it affects the revenue. And, frankly, to get to number five, operational efficiency mindset. As a marketer, we're going to stick with the marketing example, how is marketing efforts affecting sales? Are the leads clear and uh,
Yeah,
robust enough to maybe make the sales process shorter, right? Less education, or how does it affect client execution based on what's
yeah,
being promoted as a marketer? Like understanding how everything has an operational efficiency and where your cog in the wheel fits, I think
yeah.
that's another area to differentiate yourself amongst the sea of CMOs or any other CXO, whatever the discipline is.
Yeah, just to add, let's bring in, different functions. Let's say you're an HR exec,
Mhm.
and you need to be able to show how you took I'm going to use the word bureaucracy of HR, right? There's a lot of processes and procedures that are absolutely necessary to
Mhm.
run an effective HR organization.
Right.
But you need to be able to understand where those lines need to be drawn so they're not stifling growth, or they're not
Mhm.
frustrating the employee base, or so you just in any function you can kind of think of those areas that are operationally inefficient. They may make your report look good on your desk, but
Mhm.
they're not providing an efficiency to the total organization. And those are just things to kind of think through as you are looking at your role and your career, and readying yourself perhaps for a role within PE, that it's really about how your function has enabled the business to operate more effectively and more profitably, or in a higher growth curve. And it just keeps going back to that. So even when you think about operational efficiency, um, you certainly have to have an operational efficiency mindset to
Yeah.
live in these environments.
Mhm.
Um, so you need to be able to implement quickly, things that can, save time, save money fast, and that are replicable and sustainable. That's a critical component, particularly, if you're an operating exec, or an exec, or in an area where you have that ability to affect the operations of the company.
Mhm.
Boy, if you can help them run more effectively and efficiently quickly, it's a huge asset.
No, and there's been some questions about, how does this apply to, trying to transition from consulting to PE. I mean, I think it's the same answer if you're trying to transition from a non-PE background into PE. The key is to connect the dots between how you have an execution-oriented mindset, how you can make very speedy decisions with data, how you demonstrate your growth and transformation experience. Like the points we've talked so far, you have to be able to show, like
Yes.
think of the end in mind, right? This is a marketing exercise. The end in mind is to get into a PE-backed organization in any particular role, whether it's the operating partner, whether it's a CXO. What do they want to see? Well, they're wanting to
Yeah.
see, so far we've covered five, out of the nine, but you need to show the transferable skill set, whatever you're transferring from into private equity, the answer is the same.
Yeah, and maybe I can bring in, when you think about all of that, how do you get yourself prepared for a private equity interview? I know I'm jumping ahead a little bit, but it kind of fits what we're talking about. So as you're thinking about shoring up these questions that Lisa and I are bringing up, one thing you need to outshine the competition on an interview, right? I mean, at the end of the
Right.
day, the interview is if you're interviewing for a job, you need to come in first place. I mean, that's how you get the job. So there's very little wiggle room for not being prepared.
Hmm.
And this sounds so simple, but I will say, more often than not, when we see interviews go poorly, or someone not really do well on an interview, it invariably comes down to poor preparation, which is amazing. But so when I say preparation, really know your stuff. You have one shot. You get a first impression. You make that first impression count.
Right.
So the more time you spend prior to the interview, research the company, research the private equity firm, research the market, particularly if you're coming from outside that lane, and
Right.
you're trying to kind of jump into the lane that this company is in. You need to know as much as you humanly can get your hands on about what's going on in that sector.
Investment
And
philosophy and different decision
yeah,
making.
get as much as you can, right? I mean, go into the news section of their website. Have they just acquired a company? Did they just partner with someone? Did they just launch a product? Whole host of things are typically identified in the news and noteworthy sections of these
Right.
websites. And know what's going on as much as you can. If you know people who are in that sector, talk to them. If you know people at the company, talk to them, certainly. But even if you know people in competitors, get to know what's going on in that space. The more prepared you are, I guess, is the takeaway here. The better you'll perform. And it's just something that sounds so rudimentary, but it's something to pay attention to. And I think also, if you're coming from outside the lane, I keep saying, but if you're someone, maybe you don't have PE experience, or you're coming from an environment that's not directly competitive with the company that you're interviewing for, um, make sure you can answer the questions that Lisa and I, or the points that we've been talking about around, where you've affected growth, where you've affected operational efficiency, where you've affected the organization in a proactive way. But when you're asked these questions, be succinct and direct. You know, Answer the questions that's asked of you with examples, with some background to it, but then wait for the next question. Oftentimes we also get feedback that the individual just droned on. They wanted to continue to explain, but you have to read the room. You have to read,
Hmm.
understand, this is a hard one to kind of coach, but you just have to sort of understand when you've answered the question, and when you feel the interviewer or the person who's going to pose the next question is ready to pose the next question. Let them ask it. Then you'll have your chance to kind of get into a deeper dialogue about it. But we see that a lot, that feedback can be, they just went on and didn't give me a chance to ask questions. So it's
Right.
just be aware, be self-aware in that regard too. So
Yeah, which on our list here, that's touches upon number six, strong communications and stakeholder management. And I also think the preparation and the short, concise answers is a subliminal or even outwardly direct way of showing your humility
confidence,
and
yeah,
your
and confidence,
confidence.
yeah,
The low ego confidence. That's really it's a low ego confidence that that you're no better than anybody else and you got to prepare, right? Like everybody else. You're not going to just wing it because you have a charismatic stance that maybe has worked for you in other parts of your life. I think
yeah,
it's that to me all sets up that is all the behavior traits that show that you have a low ego confidence, in my
yeah.
opinion.
And just to come back to your point about stakeholder management.
Hmm.
Uh, if you're going into a private equity environment, and honestly, I do feel like this is any environment. I don't care
Yeah.
what type of company or
Especially the on and
organization.
on piece. Believe me, other executives
Yeah,
in
this
other areas
this one,
doing that.
yeah. I mean, you want to be a leader that has a consistency to your approach to communication. Particularly if you're at a leadership level, so you're
Right.
naturally in a top-down kind of vantage point. You
Hmm.
need constant feedback loops and constant communication
Right.
to move the organization. And
Hmm.
this is heightened for sure in a private equity environment because of the speed of the way things need to operate. But like I said, I think this is something that all good leaders need to continue to work on, continue to hone. When you watch interviews of great leaders, in great companies around the country, you know, oftentimes they talk about their ability to continue to master communications as their number one, uh, role enhancer. So
Mm.
this is one that, if you haven't talked to your team, in a week or 2 weeks or whatever the time frame is, go out and talk to them.
Right.
So the more you're communicating with your team, the more you're communicating with the board or whomever you
Mhm.
need to move, the better your feedback loops are going to be, the better decisions you're going to make.
And that, gets to number 8, cultural and team leadership. Um, that conference, the private equity recruiting conference, the Hunt Scanlon conference that you and I met up at in
Yeah.
May, I can't remember the gentleman who was the panelist who said it, like the ability to assemble productive high talent teams was really the difference between a Portco
Success
making
and
it or
failure.
not making it. And that
Yeah.
was like one of their common observations. And so being able to put together a team that is high performing and works well and trusts each other, is
Yeah. So
paramount. So do
no
people work
question. So
for you,
one of the things, yeah, one of the things that PE firms that I have seen, and this seems very consistent, that they really look for is, what one of my partners identified as followership.
Hmm.
So uh, do you have followership? Are you likely to be able to bring great talent with you?
Right.
That is a skill or a trait that is highly desirable at private equity environments because oftentimes they are looking to improve or increase the effectiveness of the team.
Hmm.
So yeah, your ability to recruit and to attract very, very good players
Hmm.
is paramount. And honestly, your ability to identify great talent because
Right.
there are going to be times also you walk into a new situation with you're the CFO, the CEO, or some leadership role within this private equity environment. There can be gold in the environment that just hasn't been teased out or hasn't been identified. So your ability to kind of identify who on the team currently, because look, if you can hold the disruption down a bit and not, be turning people over, that obviously is going to be an advantage. So your ability to identify those key talents within the organization, and then what do you do to engage them, to get them, to go from point A to point B and sort of tease
Hmm.
that talent out. That's a critical point of or a critical trait for a great leader in a private equity environment. So it's
What would
recruiting as well as development.
what would be some questions that, an investor might ask to demonstrate, for you to demonstrate if you're somebody who can bring people to an
Yeah.
organization or that you are a top talent magnet?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if um, well, simple is, how many people did you hire over the last couple of years? How many are still there?
Hmm.
Of that number, how many are the top achievers in the company? So it's
Hmm.
very metric. You can kind of tease it out through metrics.
Right.
But you also want to find out what the leader will do in their first, 30, 60, 90 days. I mean, it's that kind of standard, what do you do when you first assimilate into a company as a new leader?
Hmm.
The first thing that typically you should be talking about is assessing your teams, and meeting the people and finding out what makes the company tick from a human development point of view. Who are
Hmm.
the players?
Right.
Who's frustrated at the company and why?
Hmm.
Oftentimes those highly frustrated people can be the best people in the company.
Yeah.
They're
True. Yeah.
frustrated because things didn't happen in the past. So they may be thinking they're too far gone and they need to exit, off of the train, but they
Hmm.
may be prime people to identify and bring under your wing. So,
Right.
PE firms will ask about those experiences.
Hmm.
Um, and for you to talk about your top two or three people on your team and why do you identify them as the top two or three people on your team?
Right.
You know,
You know,
and
I Go ahead. Go ahead.
no, no, please go ahead.
No, no. You know, the ability to recruit and attract talent. Um, I think sometimes that is the most important but least recognized, piece. And if a leader is very good at their function, they can be silo masters, frankly, right? But if they
Yeah.
can't assemble a group of people. And this, I think, sometimes when people don't have a PE background and trying to get in PE and they're interviewing and they're not getting anywhere, they might be quite literally experts, silo masters in whatever the CXO is of the X, right? But if they aren't seeing how it's working around the executive committee table, if it's not, they're not able to attract the talent.
Yeah.
These are some areas that as a to self-reflect on, you can be highly accomplished. But if you're not doing these things, these are the reasons why you might be getting rejected. And it might not be right for you. I mean, I don't know what you think there.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Getting back to the, this semblance of teams and bringing good people with you. It is a critical aspect of most successful private equity operators.
Hmm.
They're just able to attract and or develop great talent.
Right.
So, if and you need to be able to answer the question, look at some of the get back to your question a minute ago about, what questions are asked. They may want you to, can you identify, who's the best person you brought into your team over the last couple of years, and who are they, and would you consider bringing them here?
Hmm.
That they'll be as direct at times in asking those questions. So they're
Right.
constantly thinking about team development and team growth. So yeah, I think this is often an overlooked critical aspect of functional leadership roles is the ability to recruit and develop talent. It's
And
talked
a
about
lot of
all the time. Look,
no,
honestly, I will say this: the more you can put people like me out of work, in other
yeah,
words, where they don't need to be calling me and doing a search, you can actually bring the people in. You're saving them the fee, you're saving them the time,
right.
and you're bringing people in that you are already have a kinship with or have a relationship with, that will likely have a higher degree of success in the organization. That's the bottom line to it.
And you bring up a great point there. Like, networking is such a huge piece of this. I mean, like that, because people will ask, who do you know amongst their committee table themselves? They don't always want to pay a fee to somebody like you, right? So,
Right.
like,
Yep.
the networking piece is key. It's not just aspiring to meet with the third party recruiter, because frankly, you've just added a burden of a 30% fee on top
Yeah.
of hiring you, right? And especially if you are trying to segue from a non-PE background to PE, the if that already incredibly tough transition to make is going to happen, it will be more likely to happen if there is not a 30% fee attached to hiring you.
Yeah.
So the
Yeah.
best way to do that is to do that through networking, frankly.
No doubt.
Just an economics, type of.
Yeah. Yeah. And look, there's another side to this too, and I don't know that, I don't have science, I don't have statistics to back this up, but
Mhm.
uh, oftentimes we see those leaders that are great recruiters and great talent developers
Mhm.
are actually typically the best leaders in the company. And because for a very simple fact, people like to work for them.
Yeah.
It's not just because they like the person on a personality basis. They feel like
Right.
they can be successful working for them.
Mhm.
If you feel like you can be successful working for someone, you're going to do everything you can to go work for them.
Right.
So if you're that leader and you have the ability to attract it kind of the private equity firms or any, quite frankly, go back to any environment. If you're
Mhm.
able to, do this, recruit people, network with people, have them want to work for you, that typically says you're very, very good overall as a leader. So it's just one of those things that you just can't forget to unlock that network and
Right.
unlock that ability to bring your followers with you if it's germane.
Right. And, I think this also includes, like we discussed during the prep, like being able to have difficult conversations. Like, how frequently do you talk to your team? Those are questions that could be asked to really get a sense of, are you practicing what you're preaching?
Correct.
And, if you haven't talked to your team in a couple weeks, or you can't, or you're squirmish when you asked about a tough conversation you've actually had with your team, or even with your own boss or a board director, like then that's a sign that you may not you would probably squirm if you were actually in the job too. So it's,
Fair
again,
point.
I think these are all traits of highly self-aware, emotionally intelligent, humble confidence. These are all the
Yeah.
examples of that. So sometimes
Yeah.
it's an inside job in order to portray that. We didn't touch on number seven, um, which you have here, and somebody asked if we skip seven. I said yes, just like PE environments, this is not linear. Um, but adaptability and resilience, the change-oriented mindset, comfortable leading through disruption. I feel like the last 5 years have been like ethical opportunity and chaos, right? It's just been
Yeah.
that every day for different reasons. Um, how do you prepare to show that on an interview? What are some of the questions or some of the scenarios that, whether you're in PE or coming out of PE, going into PE, like what are some of the scenarios they want to see, generally speaking?
Yeah. So, yeah, the whole change listen, change is upon us in many environments, but in the private equity environments, it's somewhat built in. If most times when a private equity firm is buying a business, they're buying it to
Hmm.
move it from point A to point B. So that, your ability uh, to adapt, the words adaptability, agility, um, embrace change, don't get mired in the process, but really look to the transition to how
Hmm.
you're getting to the other side. Um, some of the questions that get asked, one simple one is, when your team, faces uncertainty, or when
Hmm.
things are up in the air and change, they don't know which way is going, what's your go-to move to
Hmm.
keep them focused? So when you're talking about change management, you still need to keep teams focused on the tasks at hand and how they
Hmm.
move from point A to point B. Because
Right.
the one thing that can, stall a company fast is when a team stops working.
Yeah.
So change is happening. Everybody pulls in, and doesn't know what to do. So there's that frozen, moment, deer in the headlights. Well, as a leader, you need to, keep your teams focused. So PE firms will look for that leadership kind of capability to manage through change. And I'm going a little bit down the change path, but
Well, like that concept of embrace the suck, right? You have to,
well,
again,
yeah.
maturity, own it.
Yeah, it's one of the best phrases I've heard in a long time, and is embrace the suck. And this came from one of my partners, Sky. Uh, you need to really not be afraid of this. It needs to
Hmm.
be something you actually kind of get into, that you can get through the grind. You can get
Right.
through big, messy situations. If not
Hmm.
everything is messy, but you have the ability, if something's a mess or there's change going on or something affects this and you need to be that person who's not shying away from it. You're diving right onto the pile.
Right.
That is a trait that is very attractive in these private equity environments. So if you have that ability, if you're successful in that, make sure you have examples of where you've brought people through that process, because
Right.
that will be invaluable to you during the interview. Because, like I said, I don't know the percentages, but invariably every private equity situation, particularly when a new private equity firm just invests in the business, change is inevitable. I mean, it may
Hmm.
be small, it might be tweaks and changes here, but sometimes it's upheaval.
Right.
So you need to really be able to embrace that and show examples of how you've done that in the past in any environment,
Right.
and with a variety of different types of change processes that have come at you.
So, I think we covered the nine things. We will share the list shortly. Although this is a session on decoding the interview, the PE, Portco company interview, we're getting some questions about networking into private equity and what are some best ways to do that, or some inroads and whatnot.
Sure.
I know, we have a book on how to land a role, an ebook resource that Krista can put the link into, just as a supplement to all of this, on how to land a role with PE Portco companies. But you know, some of the advice we give clients are, family offices, somebody posted investment bankers, obviously anybody that's already working for a portco to get them to introduce you to the private equity held, organization. But what are some ways that people can be found? Because it's not about applying. We all know that. So how do you network?
Right.
How do you get found? What are places to start?
Yeah, look,
Any,
you touched
any
on some
advice?
of them. I mean, certainly, your own network, people that start with the obvious and the easy, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you know people in the investment banking community, or you know people that advise or service in the M&A environment, or anybody that sort of is going to be around the private equity firm uh, play is you should tap into.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, executive search people are good avenues. However, our role is typically, or and particularly in markets that are have high demand flow,
Mm-hmm.
we're reacting to the needs a lot of times, right? So,
Right.
we have a private equity relationship. They just made a purchase, or something's going on in one of their portfolio companies, and they need to make a change, and we get engaged.
Mm-hmm.
So there are going to be times where we're reactionary. So it's harder for us to market someone in that doesn't exactly fit the remit of the search.
Right.
That being said, um, find recruiters that are more proactive in their thinking around their
Mm-hmm.
relationships with private equity firms. You know, uh, Firms like ours that will do introductions of great executives to private equity partners throughout the year.
Mm-hmm.
We're a partner to the PE firm, so when we see someone we feel is a really good potential exec for this sector or that sector, or this private equity firm or that
Mm-hmm.
private equity firm, we will introduce those people to the private equity investors. And invariably a conversation will be had, and that may or may not turn into a job, but it certainly increases your network. And if it's not that private equity firm that you end up working with, that person might know this person who knows the whole train of referrals. So you need to find search partners that actually look at this field as a profession,
Mm-hmm.
not as a transaction.
Right.
And not to diss any search consultants out there, but
No,
if
no.
you can identify those people who are just going from transaction to transaction, and that means they're busy, so that's great, but they may not be as helpful to you in trying to just open some doors that may not be the doors might not be identified yet. So, we'll work a lot with private equity firms around, pre-deal due diligence, where
Mm-hmm.
if a private equity firm is looking to get into a particular sector or strengthen a sector they're already in, they want to talk to people who are very talented or accomplished in that sector. So
Right.
we'll often introduce them to people just because they're in the consumer distribution sector, let's say, and
Right.
they're very, yeah. So those kind of recruiters are going to be the most helpful to you typically. But yeah, the ability to differentiate yourself in the market is going to come mostly through networking.
Right.
It's highly unlikely you're going to just send a resume into a private equity firm and expect them to, call you back and say, yeah, you're perfect for this job. I mean, sure, it could happen, but you shouldn't
It's a
wait for
small
that for sure.
probability. And I say that as the resume writer. I mean, it's a small probability. And then you need to be
Yeah,
prepared for the chat, in the
yeah.
ways
Let's
that
talk
you
about yeah. Let's just briefly, Lisa, on resumes.
Okay. I'll always talk that.
Well, make sure your resume is highly credible, highly results oriented,
Hmm.
succinct, and direct. You don't need to explain everything in your resume. You need to show accomplishments. You need to show action. You need to then explain how you did it in an interview. But you're going to get the interview because of the
Right.
results that you've achieved and where you achieved them and how you achieved them. So I just, one note on, as a person who reads, tens of 20s of resumes a day, um, you can pretty quickly move resumes into pile A and pile B just based on how quickly the person gets to the point.
Right. No, and this is again one of these subliminal things. When your resume is highly dense, a lot of words, small font, not a lot of white space, that subliminally sends a message. It's the
Yeah,
equivalent, it's the resume equivalent of droning on in an interview.
yeah.
Like you can't say that you're a concise communicator if somebody needs to zoom in. Don't forget, a lot of times people are reading this, they're over 40, they need glasses to read things. It's got to be, it can't be tiny.
What are you saying?
I don't know. I'm just saying, 50
Yeah,
here, just not wearing the glasses right now. But yeah, so I mean, these are the things an overall executive presence that conveys these traits. It's not just, it's not a box checking, tell me what to do and I'll do it. It's something you really have to practice and
and
embody. I had a quick
yeah, I
question.
agree. If I could, let me
Somebody
just.
asked,
Oh, yeah,
somebody
go ahead.
asked if
Sorry.
you really need an MBA. And I think I know
Oh,
the
good.
answer to that, but
Great question. Um, Look, I mean, well, I'll say this. My guttural answer is no, but there are situations where an MBA background is preferred or is more attractive, but, you know, typically in most roles, your accomplishments, your experience, and your ability to deliver are going to overshadow your education. Now, I'm
Mhm.
not minimizing if you have a great MBA or you have an MBA, it should be an asset, and it is an asset. But
And
you
it's
asked
a
the question, is it
networking, it shows your access to networks too.
absolutely? Well, absolutely. I was going to actually say that, but you asked the
Yeah.
question, is it necessary? Um, I don't think so. I think, look, like I said, there are going to be some roles, and there are going to be some searches that, they do have a high bias towards an MBA for a variety of
Mhm.
reasons. But I will tell you, most of the searches I've done in the past 5 years, I can count on one hand where it was an absolute critical factor that you
Right.
absolutely had to have the MBA. And I can also tell you that, we placed, many people get placed even in searches that had MBA either needed or strongly preferred,
Mhm.
that we end up placing somebody without the MBA because their skills, experiences, and overall leadership persona were so good that they forget about the fact that they don't have an MBA.
Right.
So MBAs are great, and MBAs can add a lot of value. And then certainly, like you said, they open up a network. Um, but from a functional, need, it's more important that you have great growth experience than you received your MBA. Now, if you have your MBA and you've had great experience, well, you're that further, up the chain.
Right. No, I think it's like anything else. If you lean into what you have, right? You exploit ethically the biases that can work in your favor. And then the ones where you're not shoring up as well, you need to really show the counterpoint to why this is something they can overlook. It's like
That's
any
right.
other marketing exercise, right? I mean, none of us are perfect. Everybody has a wish list anytime they do something, and the key is to counter where you need to counter, exploit ethically where you need to exploit. But what else can you leave us with in our last minute? Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Andy. This has been really great. The feedback's been awesome.
No, I appreciate it. It's unfortunate an hour is narrowly enough time to get into this topic, but I would just say, the last thing I would say is just, be very self-aware, understand where your secret sauce is,
Hmm.
and accentuate the secret sauce. In other words, when you're putting your marketing package together, your resume, your
Right,
ability to get in front of people, you want to put those things that are most attractive and most accomplished in front and center and succinctly. And private equity is not as big, scary a place as a lot of people think. It's just
right.
it kind of puts all of these business factors into a microscope a little bit and just heightens them. But the opportunities are significant for the right people.
No, I think it's great. And the more creative you can be about, again, exploiting ethically what works in your favor and downplaying what doesn't, that's essentially, marketing 101 for anybody, whether you're coming out of PE, going and staying in it, or transferring to it from something that's not necessarily PE backed. But this has been awesome. Thank you everyone for joining us and all of your great questions. I hope we got to everything. If I know Krista put in the chat a way to, look up Andy's company, find both of us on LinkedIn. Um, ways to chat with me. If you're interested, you can obviously reach out to us on LinkedIn if we didn't get to your question. And so, yeah, and thank you, Krista, for keeping everything moving like you always do. So
Thanks,
thank you
guys.
again,
Thank you,
Andy.
everybody.
You're a
Thank you. It was
gem.
a lot of fun.
I appreciate it so much.
You got it.
Thank you. Take care,
Take care,
everyone.
everyone.